Hi there, welcome back. This is the more detailed video going over the CA monitor top. This is for the serious fridge geeks out there. For every fridge that I review, I'm going to do a short overview video and then a longer video that kind of goes more in depth of how these things work. This is the latter of the two. So, we're going to kind of tear into this, see how it works, and you might learn a thing or two. This is definitely a weird fridge. For those of you that didn't see the first video, this fridge uses methyl formate as a refrigerant, which is really interesting because it's a low pressure refrigerant. In fact, it's so low pressure that when this is running under, normal load, it's just kind of coasting along, just normal day-to-day refrigerating duties. The high side of the system is actually in a vacuum, and the low side of the system is in a much stronger vacuum, of course. Most of you would find that pretty odd, actually, and I can see why, because there really aren't any domestic refrigerators that have been made for quite a long time that can say that. So it's pretty interesting in that regard. Another interesting aspect about the refrigerant is that it's not a greenhouse gas. Well, it is a greenhouse gas, but it's a very small greenhouse gas. I think it has global warming potential of like less than 25. When you compare that with R134A and some of the other popular refrigerants, that's actually quite low. It is also not an ozone depleting gas, so that's always good. And it's non-toxic. Of course, you don't want to just sit there and breathe the stuff in all day, but for the most part, it's actually pretty non-toxic. And that was really the main factor that General Electric had in mind whenever they designed this refrigerator. They basically designed this refrigerator around the new methyl formate refrigerant that they had developed. And keep in mind that it was developed by GE. They were the only company to ever use methyl formate as a refrigerant. It's never been used since. It was never used before. They only ran these for 2 years. This is the Form A Model CA monitor top, built in 1933. There's also a Form B CA monitor top made in 1934, respectively. After that, it was all over. So this was kind of just a weird blip in the timeline of refrigerators. Not many people know about these CA monitor tops. Going back to the toxicity concern, one of the major factors, contributing factors of why GE decided to develop this new refrigerant was because what was in use up until that point was a pretty nasty refrigerant called sulfur dioxide. Now, I'm not going to scare you and say that any fridge that uses sulfur dioxide should be handled by the bomb squad, but it is a pretty nasty refrigerant. You really don't want this stuff leaking out into your house. If you've ever smelt it, you will never forget that smell. It is extremely pungent and an extremely penetrating odor. It will drive you out of the room, no doubt about it. Let's see. Because of the low pressure nature of this refrigerator and the fact that it operates at such low pressure, they decided to develop a whole new type of compressor, starting with the CA series. It is actually a type of rotary compressor, and here's a picture of the compressor from the manual. It actually shows how it operates. You can kind of see how it oscillates. It doesn't really just rotate, it kind of oscillates. Kind of an interesting design. Very, very precise machining went into this compressor. If it wasn't machined just so, it wouldn't work. And that's kind of true with a lot of rotary compressors, but this one is, obviously no exception. Now that you kind of see how a compressor works, you can see that it's kind of an odd duck, especially for back then, when there were still many manufacturers that were using belt drive units that actually use sulfur dioxide in them. Imagine that, having this ancient, new for back then, belt drive unit in your kitchen filled up with a toxic gas that may or may not leak out at some point. It's kind of, unnerving, and that's kind of what pushed development of this. I mean, this was a period of time when manufacturers, including GE, they didn't put any limits on their development team. They basically just told them, okay, here's our issue. We want to make a more user-friendly refrigerator. We want it to be more efficient. We want it to freeze ice faster. We want it to have more capacity. And we wanted to use a non-toxic refrigerant. Just have at it and design whatever you feel. And this is what they came up with. Now, it all sounds great, right? Why aren't we still using these to this very day? Well, there's one major problem with methyl formate, and that is the stability of the refrigerant. It is not a stable refrigerant at all, especially when, in the age that we live in, we don't really even, pay much attention to that, because all refrigerants that we use for the most part are very, very stable. We don't have to worry about them breaking down. Not so with this. The methyl formate will break down over time due to moisture in the system, and there's been speculation that even heat built up in the system as it's working hard, like on a hard summer day, could actually cause it to break down as well. What happens when it breaks down? Well, it forms something called non-condensable gases. And unfortunately, that means that you have to bleed them out every once in a while. If you look back here, this is the float valve. This refrigerator is actually old enough to use one of these. Really, all of the original refrigerators had a similar metering device. Some of them were located on the high side of the system, like this one is, and some of them were located on the low side of the system. But basically, what it does is the liquid refrigerant coming out of the condenser coil actually flows into this chamber, fills it up until the float lifts up, and then a little needle will lift out of the seat that is in here and will allow the liquid refrigerant to go into the evaporator where it can boil off and do its cooling job. Works perfectly fine until you get those NCGs in the system. Those non-condensable gases, what they do is they like to collect in this float valve at the top. And over time, they will actually put enough pressure on the float valve. They'll put downward pressure on it that will actually prevent it from opening and doing its job. So you've got pressure coming from down here from the non-condensable gases, and you've got pressure coming from the liquid refrigerant being pumped out by the compressor coming up. But since this system runs at such low pressures, and remember, this under normal operation, this would be in a vacuum. It wouldn't even be positive pressure. The pressure of the non-condensable gases will overcome the pressure of the liquid refrigerant, and no liquid refrigerant can be admitted to the evaporator. It stops cooling, and the next thing you know, GE is getting hundreds and thousands of service calls. And I think that they kind of knew this at the time. I believe that at the time, they kind of realized that these non-condensable gases were an issue. And the reason I say this, and this is speculation, this is, all of what I'm about to say is a lot of speculation. So please take this with a grain of salt. I'm only basing this off of the models that came out, when they came out, and what GE did to each new model that did come out. Basically, in 1933, this model, the CA Form A, was released to the public. In the past, the previous model for the General Electric company was the DR monitor top. That was their first hermetically sealed refrigerator available to the mass public. There's another side to that story that some people got to try out some before it got released to the public, but that's another story. So basically you had the DR monitor top. Well, in 1933, when GE came out with the CA, they only released the size 1 and size 2 machines. What does that mean? Well, basically what that means is they only released the small apartment size models like this one. This is size 1. They released the size 2 models meant for, most average households, but they did not release the size 3 models that had previously been filled by the DRs that would appeal to like small restaurants, hotels, or really rich people that had a large household and wanted a really big refrigerator, and really big being like about 13 cubic feet and above, which we consider absolutely tiny nowadays. For comparison, this is only 4.7 cubic feet, which is mini fridge territory now. Anyways, so you basically in 1933 didn't have the option of buying a size 3 CA. They never made it. So what would you do if you wanted a really big refrigerator from General Electric back then? They sold you a DR. They sold you their old stock, basically. They weren't manufacturing them at that point, I don't think. I may be wrong about that, but I think they were just selling their leftover size 3 models. And they kind of realized this was a problem. I believe that the only reason they didn't make a size 3 CA is because they kind of were trying to test the waters with it. They probably knew that the NCGs were going to become a reoccurring problem, but they kind of wanted to test the waters with it. You have to remember, this is 1933. This was during the Great Depression. GE had invested a lot of money into this to make it a viable refrigerator, and they really succeeded, except for the problem of NCGs, which really wasn't their fault. They maybe should have tested it a little bit better before they released it to the public, though. So I believe that at this point, when they released the Form A, they immediately started designing 2 other models. The 1934 Form B, which was basically a Band-Aid to this model to make it a little less susceptible to NCGs, and the 1934 size 3 CK models, which would actually then go to fill the hole that was left over in the 1933 model year. I know this is getting kind of complicated to follow, bear with me. So at this point in 1934, you could buy a size 3 General Electric that was brand new design, but it was not the CA. And it even used sulfur dioxide again. That's right, they reverted back to the sulfur dioxide, probably because they didn't know where else to turn. Sure, they could have used the new R12 that was coming out on the market. It was very new at that point. It had only just been developed, I think, the year previous. But GE was very picky about what patents they would use from other people. If at all possible, they always wanted to have their own patents being used. And guess who had R12 patented? Frigidaire, their arch nemesis. They really didn't want to pay Frigidaire to use R12 in their fridges, even though, of course, later on everybody went on to adopt R12 as the de facto refrigerant standard for household refrigerators. So, what was the Form B Band-Aid like? Well, basically, the difference between Form A and Form B is Form B, the only real difference that most people will be able to see is that the control has been moved from the base to the middle of the condenser coil, or condenser plate, I should say, and that the condenser plate itself, instead of having 10 evenly spaced ribs like this that actually have the refrigerant flowing through them, it would have 6. It'd have 3 on top, 3 on bottom, and then a space in the middle where the control was. And guess what? The CK that came out in 1935, when they released the size 1 and 2 models, used the exact same condenser coil as did the 1934 size 3 models. So kind of interesting. They were kind of, making steps towards what they thought was going to really work for them. Other interesting bits about the CA Form B, one of the things that they did to try and minimize the effect that non-condensable gases had on the system was they moved the float from over here to actually behind the condenser coil, and they made it much taller. They actually made it come all the way up to the top. Well, what does that do? Well, remember how I said earlier that non-condensable gases like to collect in the top of the float chamber when the machine is running. So, you have a much taller float chamber, you've got a lot more space for those non-condensable gases to collect before it actually starts to build up pressure and press on that float. Thereby, you don't have to bleed it near as often, which, resulted in a lot less service calls. Another thing that they did was they actually drilled a really tiny hole where I think it actually was a hole in the needle itself, and they put a really tiny capillary tube in this hole. So basically, under normal circumstances, the capillary tube wouldn't allow the liquid refrigerant to pass by the float valve. The float valve would still stop it, just like normal. But non-condensable gases would actually get passed through this little tube into the evaporator and just circulate throughout the system more and more, instead of just getting trapped there in the float valve. Because under normal circumstances, it just kind of sits up here and the float valve just kind of lazily comes up and it only lets the liquid by because it's all happening down here, not up here. So that little tube allowed the gases that would collect up in the top of the float valve chamber to pass through the system, and then your float doesn't get held anymore, and your fridge is a lot happier for a lot longer. Did it work? Yes. I'm sure that the service calls came a lot later, probably far outside of the warranty period that they originally gave them. I think they had a 3-year warranty, which was pretty good at the time, but it was a Band-Aid, basically. The Form B CA was a Band-Aid because of the problems of NCGs. They knew it, and that's why the year after, in 1935, they came out with the CK. And that's a different story. That's a whole totally different ball of wax. Very, very bulletproof machine, the CK. But that doesn't mean that these are unreliable. They're actually quite reliable if you know what you're doing. If you keep the NCGs bled and you make sure that it's operating right, they're fine. The other caveat to that, though, is if you let one of these run for a very extended period of time, when the NCGs are building up, it can actually hurt the float valve because you've got all this pressure pushing against the seat and it's not going anywhere. And when the float valve does kind of halfway lift up, there's a lot more pressure behind that liquid than there normally would be, so it actually would wear out the seat, which is not good. So basically what would happen is it would wear the float valve out over time, and now a common fix for these is to completely bypass the float valve and put in a capillary tube anyways. And they actually seem to run better with a capillary tube in there anyways. So, you know, nothing is ever truly broken. If you have one of these that has a float valve that is misbehaving and you can't even get it to work right by bleeding it, you can still fix it. You can put a capillary tube in there and it will continue to work, which is pretty cool. Let's see, what else is really interesting? Oh, like the DR style monitor top that came before it, the whole dome of the refrigerator is actually on the high side of the system. So because of that, when the compressor is in like a cold room and it turns on, you can actually get liquid refrigerant condensing in the oil, and you don't want that. It's going to wash out the bearings and it's going to make it sound noisy. It's going to cause premature bearing wear and all kinds of other nasty stuff. So to combat that, GE put one of the very first industry crankcase heaters in the base of the compressor to basically boil off the refrigerant that could collect in there so that you can run it in a cold room and it's not going to clatter like crazy. That's another common failure for these, is that the little tiny heater, I think it's like 15 watts, 13 watts, will die, and all of a sudden it's not operating right, and it's loud, and it's noisy, and people don't know what's going on, and that's what's going on. The heater just has to be replaced, and you can actually get replacement heaters. I'm actually a member of a forum that specializes in General Electric monitor tops, and we have all kinds of resources for how to get these parts. So look in the description at the bottom of the video, and you can actually find a link that goes to the forum, which will give you all kinds of information, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about your grandma's fridge. You know, we love to keep these things going. They're really, really neat creations. Let's see, what else is interesting about this? Oh, kind of an interesting footnote. We take it so much for granted with modern fridges, or even old fridges, but the 1933 CAs, the nicer models, not this one, but the nicer models, actually were the very first to have interior illumination. Ooh, a light bulb! Can you imagine that? You look back on it, you can't believe that it took them years to even think of that, to just put a simple light bulb in there, but apparently it did. And it was an option. Like, you had to pay for that really nice model to even get that. Eventually it became standard though, of course. Really neat feature right here, if you look at the control, I don't know why, but I've always really liked this style of control. Very nice. You've got two separate knobs here. You've got one that has off, on, and defrost. So obviously off and on, you know what that means. But defrost, you turn it to that, it will actually raise the evaporator temperature above the point of freezing, and all the frost melts off. And then, once it gets there, it kicks the unit back on so that your food doesn't spoil. You can leave it this way overnight. Then when you come back in the morning, you just empty your drip tray and you turn it back to on. Simple as that. Of course, you have your temperature adjustment knob right here. Very simple, just 1 through 9. And if you look right here, it says, when red, turn to off, then to on. And what it means is there's a little window right here, and it's kind of covered with a lot of gunk right now, but if this unit were to ever trip the overload, there's a little red flag that appears right here, and basically just tells you, oh, okay, something happened, reset it by turning the unit off and then back on, and then it just starts going again. Pretty cool. If you look at the interior, well, you might actually have to. And if you look at the door here, kind of neat. I mentioned this in the other video, but just really nicely styled handle. You didn't have to put this little end on here, but they did. They could have just, tapered it off right there, but no, just a little concession to style. You open it up, and you've got a usable interior, a very quaint interior compared to modern refrigerators. 4.7 cubic feet. This was the smallest model they had, as I mentioned before. This would have been like the apartment size model. You got space here for bottles and tall stuff. They actually advertised this chiller tray as being able to store extra ice cubes or meat if you wanted to keep it longer. Obviously, this is your evaporator right here, nice and frosty. Defrost it whenever it needs it, obviously. Water will fall right into this drip tray, and then you just empty it out. Very simple. This refrigerator is interesting simply because it still has the drip tray. Most of them got broken from people pouring hot water on them over the years. It also has all of its racks. Most people over the years would just steal them and use them on the barbecue grill or something. So it's nice that it still has all of those. And it's also nice that this refrigerator has all of its original paperwork. The original bill of sale, the original warranty paper, and what was the other one? The 4-year replacement contract. It has all of those, which I thought was actually really interesting. It's a fridge that's always been well taken care of, and fortunately, all I had to do to really make it work was replace the heater and bleed the non-condensable gases, like I mentioned before, two of the most common things that go wrong. And I've been running it for over a month now, and it's fine. It hasn't had one hiccup at all. It's keeping good cycle times, and it's reasonably efficient for something from 1933. In later videos, I'll go over about how efficiencies increased much more, especially with the CK models that came out directly after this. So this is kind of, this kind of been going over the CA model in general, kind of what makes it interesting, what makes it unique. One last little thing before I go, I kind of touched on it, but this is obviously the condenser coil. You've got the compressor in the middle. There's actually fins, you can't see them right now, there's fins in between the compressor and the condenser coil that actually help to cool it off more. They help cool both the compressor and the condenser coil off. Kind of neat, kind of overbuilt really. And the condenser coil itself is interesting because this was the first year they used sheets of steel that were corrugated, and they line welded them together to make these little bumps that you see, and that's what the refrigerant passes through. Pretty neat. A lot of times this thing runs so efficiently and quietly. You can put your hand on here and you would think something's wrong because it's not even warm, but no, it's perfectly fine. The condenser coil really doesn't get that warm unless you're really making it work hard. So, Well, they really don't build them like this anymore, and they only built them like this for a very short period of time at GE. So it's kind of an interesting blip in the history of refrigeration. So I'm glad that you took the time to look at it with me. I hope that you enjoyed it. I'll be doing many more videos like this, going over all kinds of different models of refrigerator. Most of them won't be this long, but this one's kind of special edition because it's a special fridge. It's very different. Most people have never even heard of Methyl formate, so it's kind of neat. We're all looking for new replacement refrigerants in this day and age, and while methyl formate is far from perfect, it's kind of interesting that they had something that was, quote, green back then that they were using. So until next time, preserve these beauties, don't abuse them, and I'll see you later.